The way we want to get clear on understanding about how to go about evaluating, and we'll spend some time on reconstructing argument, but the way we're going to go about evaluating arguments is going to require that we have a pretty good understanding of what the criteria, the considerations are when we decide whether an argument is good or bad. And we want to be really precise about how to do this. And a way to get at this, and we're going to consider an argument that I think a lot of you thought was not a good argument. Consider the argument. It was one of the ones we presented right at the beginning of this series of videos, this series of lectures, is the following. Drugs should be legal. After all, those who use drugs only harm themselves. Okay, now step number one, we have to figure out what is the argument. How do we construct the argument? And the first thing in looking to reconstruct the argument, we usually try to see what the conclusion is. Well, what is the conclusion in this case? Pretty clear, the first sentence, even though I left out the period. On the slide, drugs should be legal. And the next, what premises lead, or what premise leads to that? Drugs only hurt those who use them. Notice we have short statements, very precise statements. This shows us what the argument looks like. This is really an easy one because the argument, as stated, only had two sentences. One was the premise, one was the conclusion. But I think it's a good illustration of how we decide if an argument is a good one or a bad one. That is, most of us think that this was a bad argument. I hope everybody thinks that this one is a bad argument. But the way we decide, or the way you figure out what criteria you use, think about somebody who is going to provide a clear criticism of this argument. What would the critic say about it? And I think what we can distinguish is two different kinds of criticism. But why don't you guys put the video on halt for a second, on pause, and write down, think about it. How do you guys think we could criticize an argument? Think of two different ways. And don't think so much about this one, although think about this one. Why do you think this is a bad argument? Now that you're back, you've thought about it for a while, think about it. I mean, some people are concerned that, oh, gee, they're not sure what certain things mean, and that's an important thing to consider. That is, when we state an argument, when we reconstruct the argument, we want to be pretty precise. So some people might ask, well, what kind of drugs are you talking about? Are you talking about aspirin? I mean, after all, that is legal. You want it illegal? You want to make aspirin illegal? Are we talking about narcotics, heroin? Are we talking about alcohol? Sometimes people say that's a drug, and things like marijuana come up. Well, think about the drugs. Right now, drugs are legal. Let's say it's marijuana, heroin, cocaine, all of those bad drugs. Let's assume that that's what I'm talking about for drugs. I want to restrict our discussion to that. But in looking at the two ways of criticizing it, we can see that the critic can say two things. Well, first of all, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. And here we're talking about follow logically from the premise. That is, from the fact that drugs only hurt. Assume drugs only hurt people who use them. It doesn't follow that it should be legal. That is, letting your kids jump off the roof of your building, and let's say you live on a 10-story building, will only hurt those kids. That is, the kids doing it. It doesn't mean that we should make it legal for little kids to jump off a 10-story building, does it? So it doesn't look like that conclusion follows from the premises. And that, we say, is an invalid argument when the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise or premises. And by contrast, one of the things that makes a good argument is that it would be valid. The second one is, wait a second, look at what happens. Drugs don't only hurt the people who use them. That is, parents who are drug addicts neglect their children, they hurt their families, they hurt other people who live around them. So another kind of criticism that's raised is there is a problem with a premise or all of the premises. So notice we have two different ways that a critic would argue against it. So when we say that the premise is false, you're going to see, and we're going to define this precisely, an argument can be, this argument is not only is it invalid, doesn't the conclusion follow, but it's also unsound because the premise is false. And by contrast, a good argument has two characteristics, the flip side of those two problems. One is that there is a good connection between the premises and conclusion. There is what we might call a logically strong connection between the premises and the conclusion. That's one thing. And the second thing that makes an argument good is that it has good premises. So in the case of the first one, when we have the good connection between the premises and the conclusion, logically strong, we say it's valid. In terms of good premises, usually we think of the premises as being true. And now to kind of define what a good argument is, we come up with this new term. We're going to say an argument is sound. A good argument is a sound argument. And D4, definition number 4, tells us that an argument is sound if and only if, just in case, two things have to happen. Number one, it's valid, that the premises follow logically from the conclusion follows logically from the premises, or the premises logically lead you to the conclusion. And the second thing is all of the premises are true, right? Because if the premises lead you to the conclusion, the premises are kind of the foundation of the house. But if it's a rotten foundation, the house is not going to stand. So you need the premises to be good ones, true ones. So those are the two characteristics of a good argument, and we're going to spend some time looking at what makes, especially a bunch of time, what makes an argument a valid argument.